Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Jeff Short. Glad to have you along today for the commentary. Today we're going to be looking at something that occurred a week or so ago, and that is the whole debacle, the whole colossal collapse of so-called conservative Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. If you remember, one of the big selling factors for Christians voting for Trump in 2016 was that he would appoint conservative Supreme Court judges that would interpret the Constitution and law rather than making constitutional law as if you were a legislator. So we were concerned because the liberal Supreme Court justices would always draw up rulings that were more legislation than they were interpretations of the Constitution, of other laws, etc. So we were very concerned about the president appointing conservative, strict constructionist, literal interpretation of our Constitution, so we don't get this creative writing exercise like we saw, for example, in the infamous Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, where the majority of the Supreme Court justices went into the Constitution and just went crazy interpreting it in any which way they wanted to. And so we wanted to stack the court with solid, conservative, strict literalist so that we don't have to deal with this problem of activist judges, because every time a Democratic president sits in the White House and picks a Supreme Court justice, it is always, by definition, an activist, liberal, radical judge. And they never, ever change to be conservative. They never come at the Constitution in the normal and ordinary way that you would interpret in any document. Instead, they come to the interpretation of whatever is best for society at that given moment, and if it takes creative writing, they will creatively write a decision based on what they feel is best for the country at the moment, regardless of what the original intent of the framers of the Constitution was, disregarding the original intent of the legislators who produce a law. And so the best way that Christians and social conservatives could combat that activistic judge would be to replace them when they come up for replacement with conservative judges who don't create law, but they interpret the law. And so one of the big selling points of Trump was that he had a list of judges that he would pick from in appointing Supreme Court judges. And this was vetted by a conservative think tank, and it looked golden, for example, for Christians when they were looking for Trump and saying, hey, if he's going to pick from these judges, and these judges have been all vetted by the leading judicial conservative think tank, then we've got it made. All we have to do is elect Donald Trump, and he will appoint conservative judges to the bench, and then eventually we can correct the 1973 Roe v. Wade disaster of activist judges. We can reverse that. We can roll that back, as well as other things that come up before the court. We can make sure that it is interpreted and not created. Laws are not created whole cloth by the Supreme Court, but we can get back to a more sane and sensible way of interpreting the laws and the Constitution of our United States. And so that was our strategy. And so for the many decades since Roe v. Wade, I think Christians every 4 years have been saying, hey, we've got to elect this conservative because he will appoint conservative judges. Well, we come to the Supreme Court decision a week or so ago, and the whole strategy that we have been pursuing by appointing conservative judges to the Supreme Court, that has failed. And why do I say that? Because Neil Gorsuch, who was Trump's first judicial selection to the Supreme Court, who was the one that conservatives and Christians and social conservatives fought for and defended his appointment because he had been vetted by the super conservative judicial think tank. And Trump appointed him, and we supported him, and we said, great, now we have another conservative on the bench. And then a year or so later, Judge Brett Kavanaugh comes up, and we fight in support for him because he was also on the list of those conservative judges who would interpret the Constitution faithfully and not create law and not be activist judges. And so he was appointed, and now we're saying, we have a majority conservative consensus on the Supreme Court. We can accomplish a lot. Well, we can't accomplish a lot because we can't get the judges that were supposed to be conservative to act conservative and not legislate from the bench, because we have an example of just a week or so ago, the number one appointee, Donald Trump, Neil Gorsuch, flip-flops, and now he's an activist judge. Yes, he's an activist judge. Why do I say that? Because the 1965 Civil Rights Law, Title IX, that defines sex as a man and a woman, now is being rewritten by the so-called conservative, faithful interpreter of the Constitution and laws, Neil Gorsuch, to fit in with our times, to fit in with the post-Obergefell decision of 2015, to fit in with the LGBTQ revolution. Neil Gorsuch, our guy, the one we fought for, the whole strategy hinges upon his appointment and Kavanaugh's appointment and maybe another appointment. And what got Trump elected in 2016 was Christians bought into that plan that, hey, we've got to do this because we've got to appoint these judges because they have to be on the bench when these key important decisions come down. We have to have our guys sitting on the bench to overrule the activist liberal judges appointed by the Clintons and the Obamas and the liberals. We have to have our guys on there to get these socially conservative key issues across so that we don't go down and down in decline, the moral decline of our culture, so we can reverse Roe v. Wade, we can oppose the LGBTQ revolution, and we can get back to some common sane sense as far as judges interpreting the law and not creating laws from the bench. Well, that whole plan has been shot. It's over. It's done. It's collapsed. And why do I say that? Because the whole process, the whole system has failed with this decision that saw Neil Gorsuch and John Roberts join the liberal activist judges on the Supreme Court. And they did it, not only did they just join them, but Neil Gorsuch himself wrote the decision in which he redefined the definition of sex in the 1965 Title IX legislation. He redefined that and brought it up into the 21st century instead of saying, no, the framers of this law meant, when they said the word sex, they meant either a male or a female. They meant a man or a woman. And so if there's any changes to this legislation, the civil rights legislation, it has to go through Congress, and Congress has to change that law. We, as judges, don't have the right to legislate from the bench. We simply are passive and we interpret the law. And it should have been a slam dunk. If you had asked anyone a month ago and said, okay, there's going to be a decision that comes down, and it's going to be determined with a conservative Supreme Court, and they're going to vote and they're going to decide how to interpret the Title IX civil rights ruling legislation. How do you think that'll turn out? And almost everyone would say, well, that's going to be left as it is, sent back to the legislation. If anything is changed, it's going to be the legislators that change because they're the ones that write the laws. The Supreme Court doesn't write laws, it only interprets laws. And so you would have asked anyone and they would have said, it's no problem. We've got this. We've got our conservative majority. We've got Neil Gorsuch. He's a solid conservative, social conservative understanding, original intent, understanding of the Constitution. You've got Brett Kavanaugh. He looks fairly solid. He hasn't been tested as much, but solid. And then you have the other conservative judges. And possibly we would get Justice Roberts and so on and so forth. So it was a pretty good calculation. Well, that's all gone now because the guy that we were hoping was a solid on the Supreme Court has betrayed us. He has totally betrayed us. In fact, he is not an original intent interpreter of the Constitution. He is an activist. He inserts himself into the Constitution, or in this case, a legislation from the 60s. He inserts himself into it and changes the meaning to bring it up to date with the times. And so the whole plan that we had with getting Trump elected, appointing conservative judges to the bench, hopes that reverse Roe v. Wade and these important decisions that come up, we have a solid presence, that's all shattered. It's all gone. And it's not just that. It's the whole process is flawed. And the reason it's flawed is because we cannot trust the conservative justices, the so-called conservative justices on the court, to be conservative. Even though when a liberal president appoints a liberal judge, they never flip-flop. When a conservative president appoints a so-called conservative judge, they quite oftentimes flip-flop and betray the original appointment. So that's a problem with the whole process. The other problem with the whole process is that the so-called conservative judicial think tank that we depended on, I think it's the Federalist Society, who recommends judges who are supposed to be vetting the judges, who are supposed to be looking into their backgrounds, who are supposed to be giving the president, the conservative president, a list of solid candidates for judges. They, for whatever reason, blew it with Neil Gorsuch because he is not an original intent interpreter of the Constitution. He is an activist because he's shown that he's an activist. Now, some people say, well, you really shouldn't jump the gun because this is just one case and you don't know what he's going to do on Roe v. Wade. He may actually revert back to original intent of the Constitution. He may actually become more of a strict constructionalist. He may be more in the lines of Judge Atonin Scalia. We don't know, so you can't jump to conclusions. Well, do you really think Neil Gorsuch, after having rewritten a law in the 1960s Civil Rights Code, Title IX, do you really think that if he's willing to tamper with legislation and rewrite it and fudge with it, if he's not going to let the original intent of those legislators go, do you really think that he's going to hold back in fudging around with the Constitution when it comes to Roe v. Wade? Do you really think he's going to come down solidly on overturning Roe v. Wade? You've got to be crazy. Now, he could, but it would be a contradiction in what he just did. So what he's showing, the way he interprets the Constitution, we have no assurance that he's going to reverse Roe v. Wade. And we were questioning Kavanaugh. We were wondering about what this Judge Kavanaugh was going to do with the Constitution when Roe v. Wade came under review again, possibly this year or the next year. We were wondering about him. We were always thinking Neil Gorsuch was a solid, but now we don't even have Neil Gorsuch on the conservative side. He is not a conservative judge. He does not look at the Constitution in the original intent or the original author's intent. He is an activist judge, and he already showed his stripes. And we cannot trust a list that the Federalist Society gives the president either. President Trump, I think it was just a couple days ago, was holding his first rally for the 2020 election post-COVID. And he said, you got to vote for me because we don't want Joe Biden to choose Supreme Court justices. And I thought to myself, no, wait a minute. We already know now that it doesn't matter in these big key cases who chooses the judge, whether it's you or Joe Biden, because the ones you appoint, the ones the Federalist Society gives you, the list that you choose from, that's a corrupt list anyway, because we can't even count on the Federalist Society vetted judge to look at the Constitution from the original author's intent, because we don't know what he's going to do. It's almost like when a judge, a conservative judge, comes into Washington, it's almost like there's some kind of deal with, like this movie Inception, that there's some chemical way they get into his brain and change his thinking. So all of a sudden now he's an activist judge where he was appointed to be a conservative judge. And so we have no assurance at this point. We have to start from square one, zero. This whole process about stacking the court with conservative justices so we can get things accomplished that way, it doesn't work. It has never worked in 40-some years since Roe v. Wade. And every election cycle, we have every conservative Republican candidate for president saying, you got to elect me, I will appoint conservative judges. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Half the time, the judges that are appointed are not conservative judges. So in other words, we've been played for 40 years. Now, I don't blame President Trump for this problem because he was given a list of so-called solid conservative judges who would not activate from the bench, but would interpret from the bench. They would interpret law, not insert themselves in the law. That's what the list was supposed to mean. If it didn't mean that, then it's worthless. I guess the Federalist list is worthless, and we have to recognize that. There is no way that the Federalist Society could have checked this man out, Neil Gorsuch, and passed him along to the president and missed this. So the whole process that we've been depending on in choosing judges is flawed. And so it doesn't do any good for Donald Trump in the year 2020 to say, hey, you've got to vote for me because I'm going to appoint Supreme Court justices that interpret the Constitution and not create law. That's not true. He doesn't even know what these judges will do when they get on the bench. And that's the flaw. And that's the big disappointment in Neil Gorsuch. Now, where do we stand? We stand as Christians with God, and we cannot look to any government appointment. We cannot look to any president. We cannot look to any judge. We cannot look to the reversal of Roe v. Wade. We have to trust in God and God alone. We have to pray to God that if it be his will at this point that he would reverse the terrible abortion decision. It's wrong. It's awful. It needs to be struck down. But it seems like the judges that keep getting appointed to the judgeship from our conservative Republican presidents are failing us. John Roberts is failing us. He was appointed by George H.W. Bush, and he is mostly liberal on the very important issues. Now, some people will say, well, these majority conservatives, they do vote together 80% of the time. They vote together 80% of the time on the smaller cases, the less important cases. But when it comes to the key important cases between the Supreme Court, they fail us. And the only solid ones are like Judge Thomas and Alito, but the others, Gorsuch, and we haven't really tested Kavanaugh, but There's question about him too. And we have to stop depending on people. We have to look to God. We can't look to the president. We can't look to the Federalist Society. We can't look to the conservative majority, so-called, the Supreme Court. We can't look to the Senate. We can't look to the House. We can't look to politics. We can't look to the political system, because evidently everything we try to do to win and reverse Roe v. Wade and stop the slaughter of the babies and roll back the sexual perversion of gay marriage and roll back the LGBTQ perverted revolution, everything we try to do on a judicial level fails. And so we're at the point now where this whole strategy of appointing justices isn't going anywhere as far as Roe v. Wade and these big decisions. Now, some apologists said, well, this doesn't necessarily mean that Neil Gorsuch is a bad guy. This doesn't necessarily mean that he will collapse on other issues. Well, this was a big issue. This was a really big issue. This wasn't as big as Roe v. Wade being overturned, but this was a major issue, because this issue, the one that deals with the definition of sex as a male and a female in the civil rights legislation, this one actually can affect Christian colleges and universities and even Christian churches, and it could come back to hurt Christians. Maybe they're being charged now with discrimination based on sex or whatever. This has the potential of really causing a lot of trouble in the Christian church and in Christianity in our nation, and really, really could hurt our religious liberties. And so this is not a good sign coming from our so-called conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Now, the question is, do we just abandon this process, this flawed process? Do we abandon this failed plan about stacking the court with conservative, social conservative judges? Or do we just continue on and just like ignore this major collapse of Neil Gorsuch? Well, I think it does affect our attitude toward the urgency of Supreme Court justices. I think we should, as Christians, not be naive. We should not be gullible. We should not be played by Republicans. We should not be played by presidential candidates. We should not allow them to build up this urgency. Oh, you have to elect me because I'm the only one that can appoint a conservative judge to the court, and that's the only way we can get Roe v. Wade changed. Let's keep in mind that even if we do elect that candidate, presidential candidate, who promises to appoint conservative judges, and even if we do look over his list of judges and say, yeah, they look pretty good, and even if he does appoint from that so-called conservative judge list, and even if that judge does sit on the bench, that doesn't mean that we've accomplished our goal. It doesn't mean it until Roe v. Wade is done with. And so we've been waiting for over 40 years. We've been praying for over 40 years. We've been electing conservative presidential candidates for over 40 years. And we still have nothing to show for as far as overturning Roe v. Wade. And now with this latest Neil Gorsuch collapse and disaster, it looks like it doesn't matter who a conservative president appoints to the Supreme Court, because they don't vote conservative once they're on the Supreme Court in the big issues. And if they're going to be conservative on the smaller issues, on the secondary issues, on other agenda items, what good is that? We as Christians want to see some action on the big cultural issues of our day. And if our so-called conservative judges are selling us out and betraying us and turning traitor at the key moments when they could really make a big difference, then we have to really have our eyes open and say, look, yeah, the presidential elections are important, but if we're not going to get Roe v. Wade overturned, and we're not going to hold back this LGBT perversion movement, and all of our social conservative agenda items never seem to get around to being pushed and implemented, and if we never get any of those big decisions on the Supreme Court, even with our conservative guys, so-called, then you have to ask yourself, are you being played by both sides? Are you being played by our side? Are the Republicans playing Christians for a fool? And if that's the case, we don't have to vote Republican. We certainly won't vote Democrat. But I would say to the Republicans, and I would say to even our presidential candidate, Donald Trump, I would say, unless you start producing actual change, we don't want a list of the Federalist Society conservative judges anymore. We want a guarantee that this candidate for judge on the Supreme Court is pro-life. And we want the senators to know that this man is going to vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. And I don't care how you do it. I don't care if you have to keep that secret out of the public. I don't know. But the President of the United States has to know. He has to have a guarantee that this man respects the Constitution and will not interpret it in an activist way and will not get creative with it and side with liberal activist judges at the key moment. And unless Donald Trump can guarantee that, now you say, well, nobody can guarantee it. Why do the liberals always know exactly how their judges will vote? And they vote that way. How do they know? Why are they never wrong? Why can they count on their judges to be liberal when they appoint them? Why can't we get this right? And so Donald Trump has to do more than show a list from the Federalist Society. He has to show us that he knows some way that this judge is solid, because we will not accept just his word and the Federalist Society. There has to be a better way of choosing judges. And if there's not a better way, then what's the point? What is the point? Well, I hope this commentary has raised a lot of issues, and we'll talk to you next week on another program of Christian Answers. God bless.